I'm Maya Chupkov, and I'm a woman who stutters.
And I'm Cynthia Chin, Maya's longtime friend, and I know nothing about stuttering.
And this is Proud Stutter, a podcast about stuttering and embracing verbal diversity in an effort to change how we talk about it, one conversation at a time. Welcome back to Proud Stutter, and welcome to part 2 of our interview with Jerome Ellis, musician and artist, and a person who stutters. He just came out with an album titled The Clearing, and in part 2, we go more into the album and what Cynthia and I noticed about the album, and it's a really great conversation, and we hope you enjoy it.
I think something that's really unique about your album is all the talk that you have about intersectionality. I think oftentimes in conversations about race and, ableism and anything else, we find it really hard to incorporate anything else. I think it's hard for us to really imagine a conversation that allows for us to consider multiple things. And I think that you do that really well. And everything that you're talking about, these topics are very complicated: Blackness and stuttering and time and space and music. So I think the way that you have connected all of those topics in your mind, I think it parallels really well with the way that we communicate orally. We have to formulate our thoughts, these very complex thoughts, and then we have to translate that into spoken word. So how did you go about that process, translating all of those very complex topics and intersectionality, and then translating that into poetry that people could understand?
As you were talking, I was thinking of the Audre Lorde quote about, that Audre Lorde says, "We don't live single issue lives," And I really take that to heart, that as you said, race, there can be so much good that can come from not talking or thinking about race as a single issue, but thinking about race as it is inflected by and inflects all these other forms of difference. So The Clearing, the album and the book began as an essay. I have several kind of aims. One is to bring things into conversation, to bring them into contact. I retell this Bernie Mac joke about a young black boy who stutters. And, to me, that was an example of an intersection between blackness and stuttering. But then you set that next to the narrative from a formerly enslaved ancestor who describes a narrative where the angel Gabriel comes to the formerly enslaved ancestor and describes how their stammering tongue will be loosed. And so these two, to me, examples of blackness and stuttering, in conversation placed next to each other. So that was one method I used. Another method was to engage in, more like academic theoretical language as a way of trying to parse out some of the relationships between these things. So, for example, when thinking about blackness and music, there are so many things to talk about with blackness and music, but one of the things I wanted to focus on was the way that the historian Saidiya Hartman describes the coffle when Africans who were being brought to the auction block to be sold into slavery, the way those Africans were forced to play instruments and to sing. And so at this very specific historical, knot of blackness and music, then, I talk about that very briefly. So it felt like the essay was, in some ways like a mosaic of these instances of these different fields coming into contact.
I did want to get back to track 8 because there's one part of that track that really struck me, and it's when you say, "Do not edit me." And it struck me because, like, you know, as I'm doing the podcast and as we're making decisions of where to edit, it's always been very important for me to keep my stutter as part of the podcast, obviously, but at the same time, like, I don't want to put pressure on myself to stutter. So it's this weird thing because normally I'm trying not to stutter, but then sometimes in my podcast, I'm just like letting go like so much of that like pressure that is built up throughout the day.
I find it so interesting what you're saying about like releasing from the pressures of the day, not to stutter, and like not wanting to put pressure on yourself to stutter. I find that's something I'm really fascinated by with stuttering, how there's this elusive quality. I find that it's like sometimes when I want to stutter, like when I'm on stage, you know, and I want to celebrate the stutter, then sometimes it doesn't appear. And so I've been trying to think about like, well, so there's involuntary stuttering, which feels like the way it usually manifests is that the person who stutters doesn't have control over it. And then there's this other technique, voluntary stuttering, which I find very like philosophically very interesting, because it's like, if you voluntarily stutter, are you faking it? Are you, but I think, so there's these two terms. And then what I'm trying to do is like, think about it like in a third way, through this old word. There's this old word I encountered that is, it's grallatory, grallatory, and it refers to wading birds like herons, egrets. So I've been like, well, what might a grallatory stuttering might be like as a way of thinking about, because I've been thinking about the way that like herons, they'll just stand and wait for a fish to come. And I've like spent so much time this year just like watching herons do that. And I've been like, well, I wonder if there's a way of like thinking about stuttering that's not strictly involuntary and it's not strictly voluntary, but that it involves some kind of waiting. Yeah, it's been interesting in the last few years, like talking with people, doing interviews here and there, and being very clear with them that I don't want them to edit out my stutter, including with This American Life, that I was very clear with them that I wanted to be edited out. So I'm really glad that resonated with you. Thank you. I sometimes forget about that line, because it's kind of short, like it's a short kind of simple sentence, but I'm really glad that it's in there,
I was very explicit too when I did the interview with NPR. I was like, yeah, you need to include my stutter. And they did, and it was beautiful, and I was so proud of my stutter in that moment, because it was like, because other people who stutter might hear that and think, oh wow, like she stuttered, like that's like me, and if she can do it, I can do it too. I really want to ask this question, but it's kind of complicated, so bear with me. When I listened to your album a second time, I understood why I thought listening to the first track the first time, I was thinking in my head, oh, like I didn't really hear you stutter. And I initially thought your blocks were just part of the music and blending. And then in track 2, you talk about how you never really know if it's a block or if it's like if it's an intention to, it's part of the music, or is it really just like me blocking? So I'm wondering, was that your intention with saying that and talking more about your stutter in track 2 and then leaving track 1 kind of like a mystery?
Yeah, Maya, I just wanted to say I noticed the exact same thing.
Yeah, I love this question. No one's asked me this before. Definitely, that was intentional. Yeah. I mean, so much of what I find so beautiful about the stutter is is the mystery, and all the mysteries. I feel it holds so many mysteries, and I wanted to try to honor a few of those on the album. And one of the ones I wanted to honor was like, yeah, like not revealing it right up at the front, and like I wanted the listener to be in a state of unknowing, like why is this pause happening? Like, is it intentional? Is it not intentional? Is there something wrong with the microphone? Like I find that state of unknowing so important, because I think there's so much of that in life that like even when I approach like a tree or something, and some trees I can identify, like I'm like, that's an oak tree, but some I don't know what they are, and I it's like I think there's sometimes I approach a tree and I don't know what kind of tree it is, and I'm like, and I have the impulse to like take out my phone and use the plant app and like take a picture of the leaf and identify it. But sometimes I'm like no, like let me just like stand and just like be in front of the unknown, of my ignorance, and like my not knowing what, like, and my not being able to grasp this truth, my name, because I find part of what so much I'm interested too is with like the word stutter. To many people it means so many different things, but part of my experience as a person stutters because of the glottal block is not as common in certain media. I grew up watching Porky Pig, who repeats his syllables a lot, but he doesn't really glottal block, and the King's Speech doesn't really do that. Biden doesn't really do that, and so like what part so much of my experience, including on the phone, so often is like somebody. I feel like if on the phone, if I were repeating the first syllable of a book title, then they would be less likely to hang up, because they would hear like, and they might be like, oh, he's stuttering right now. But because the glottal block so often sounds silent, I experience this so often, just like as a daily fact of my life, is that like people often don't know what's happening, and it's like it's been so painful for so many years, but I gradually have been able to be like, that not knowing, there's something important there. And there's this book that really means a lot to me called The Cloud of Unknowing, and it's from the Middle Ages, and it's by a monk, and it's a book largely about prayer, but it talks about like how we can approach God through knowledge, and we could approach God through love, and that the approaching God through love is ultimately brings us closer to God, and we often have to like leave knowledge behind. And I think about that a lot, like that track one, that like somebody might be in a state of like uncertainty and even like be uncomfortable because they're like, what's happening? And I find that really important, as opposed to like opening the album saying like, hey, I speak with a stutter, so here's what's going on, and then going, so then it was intentional that in track two, then I like reveal a bit more, so that then the listener gets an analogous experience to what happens in track 4 with the bookseller, because the bookseller also doesn't know what's happening. And what I find so interesting is that so often the person on the other end, it feels like they think there seems to be a great confidence that sometimes it feels like the thought process is like, well, I don't hear any sound, I'm going to say hello a few times. I think the most likely scenario is that the line is dropped, which is very reasonable, but it's just like it's just not true. It's not what's happening. And so it becomes a question of like, if epistemology too, just like how do like when do we think we know what we know, but we don't actually know? And I think the stutter just like holds that so beautifully. So it was very intentional, yeah. And I'm really glad to hear you both have that experience, because I was like, oh, it's a little risky to like, to like confuse the listener, but I really thought it was important.
Thank you for approaching it that way. I think it was very well executed. And the last question I have about the album, and then we have just a few quick closing questions. But my next question about your album is around track 6. This is where you also introduce Milta, and I just loved how she explained your stuttering as a form of ancestral wisdom. Yeah, I was just blown away, and I'm just wondering, like how, if you can kind of just go more into your relationship with your mentor.
So right now, she has undergone an initiation, and so her name currently is Yawo Milta, but at the time her name was Milta. Yeah, I met her in 2019, I think, in New York, when I was working on a wonderful work of theater and performance called Reconstruction with a company called The Team. And Yawo Milta is a longtime anti-racist organizer. And yeah, and just like as we got to know each other, she would just say things to me about like how my stutter struck her, and she in her spiritual practice, she has a really strong connection with the ancestors, and she told me about that. And so then when I wrote the abstract for the essay that this work is based on, I sent the abstract to her and the rest of the company, and what she reads on track 6 was her response to reading the abstract, where I was already talking about blackness, stuttering, and music together. So yeah, and it's just like, it's really important for me in the album to, have these 3 phone calls, the bookseller, part 1, part 2, and then with Yawo Milta, because Yawo Milta, to me, I wanted to include hers because it's an example of a phone call where, 1, I don't need to disclose the stutter. She already knows about it. And 2, where I feel totally safe stuttering, and where it's a conversation that is so healing, and many of our conversations between she and I are so healing. So I really wanted to like have a progression of phone calls from, 1 that is, where I get interrupted in a way, 2 where I don't get interrupted, but it's, I have to disclose, and then 3 where it's just a bath, of just like care and wisdom. So yeah, I'm so grateful that and I told her, I asked her, I was like, can you record what you wrote to me for this album I'm working on? And she was very happy to. And then I recorded that phone call. So yeah, I'm so grateful to her, and yeah, like in the album and the book, I tried to present a multiplicity of viewpoints on stuttering. So there's my viewpoint, but there's also Yawo Milta's viewpoint, and there's Bernie Mac's viewpoint, and try to present a bit of a kaleidoscope.
That's beautiful. And so as we wrap up, I did want to ask and leave our listeners who are curious what you're working on next, and what can we expect from you. Yeah, so if you can talk about like what's next for you, and also, are you planning to do any like live performances at all? I don't know. That was a question that kind of came to me.
Yeah, I'm definitely doing live performances. I'll be performing in Philadelphia, March 15th, in Savannah, Georgia, February 10th. The Savannah one will be focused on the clearing. I'll be performing in Europe in April and May, various places. New York City, I think, in February a bit. But I'm looking to like, tour more with the clearing. So, if any of your listeners are interested in hosting an event or something like that, I'm really interested in. I love engaging with people with the work. And then what I'm working on, so I'm working on the essay, as I mentioned earlier, where I'm trying to think about stuttering by thinking about herons and wading birds in general. That's That'll be for a anthology of essays on, or a collection of essays about bodies and performance. And then I'm working on a next book where book series of performances, music. It's all a very hybrid project like The Clearing that is focused on archives of advertisements from newspapers in the 18th and 19th centuries that are advertisements for enslaved people who have run away from those who believe that they are their masters. And it's a work of poetry following in the tradition of the poet Emnor Bessie Phillip, her book Zong, where she creates a book of poetry by rearranging and creating anagrams from the words of a legal case about an 18th century massacre of Africans on a ship. And so in this project, I'm creating poems and songs by rearranging words in the advertisements. And there's a subset of these advertisements for enslaved ancestors who stutter. So it's further, a way of further thinking about Black history and stuttering together. And for example, there's a line from one of the pieces that is, it goes, "A stutter is an occasion to be present in complex thought." And the line is formed entirely from words or fragments of words from the advertisement. The word complex comes from the word complexion, because the advertisement describes the complexion of the enslaved ancestor who ran away. Occasion comes from a sentence that I believe it's talking about a scar on the ancestor that was occasioned by a lash, I believe. And so all the words are taken from the ad, and so then new language arises. These images arise that I might not have arrived at had I not been restricting myself to these documents, and the documents seem to be they are documents of violence, but also documents of of escape and resistance.
Wow, sounds like you have quite a busy year ahead, and we are very much looking forward to following you along and following your work. We will be sure to include the shows that Jerome mentioned in our show notes, so be sure to check that out. And if you haven't done so, we highly, highly recommend listening to Jerome's new album, The Clearing. Thank you so much, Jerome, for being with us. It was such a rich conversation, and I am going to be thinking about all the things we talked about for a long time. And that's it for Proud Stutter. Thank you all, and see you next time. And that's it for this episode. I'm Maya.
And I'm Cynthia.
And you've been listening to Proud Stutter. This episode of Proud Stutter was produced by me, Maya Chupkov.
And edited by me, Cynthia Chen. Our music was composed by Augusto Deniz, and our artwork by Mara Ezekiel and Noah Chupkov.
If you have an idea or want to be part of future episodes, find us on Twitter @ProudStutter. You can also find us at www.proudstutter.com.
Drop us a note or share a voice memo. What's your stuttering story? What topics would you like us to cover? And what are you curious about?
And if you like the show, you can leave us a review wherever you are listening to this podcast.
More importantly, tell your friends to listen too.
Until we meet again, thanks for listening. Be proud and be you.